My parents tried to have me declared incompetent to steal my inheritance, using my disability as proof I couldn't handle money. When I confronted them, my dad said, "We're protecting you from yourself." I didn't say a word. That was 9 months ago. Yesterday, I finally completed my revenge. I was 17 when my aunt died and left me everything in her will. The lawyer called it a considerable estate with her large house and what he described as substantial assets. She made it so I would only inherit the money after I turned 21. What I thought would be the best news of my life turned into something that made my own family look at me like I was suddenly made of dollar signs. The really sick part is that they started using my cerebral palsy as proof that I couldn't handle the responsibility. At first, my parents seemed genuinely happy for me when we left the lawyer's office. Mom even hugged me and said she was proud that Aunt Matilda had recognized how much I meant to her. Dad nodded along and suggested we celebrate with dinner somewhere nice. But I noticed something weird during that car ride home. They kept exchanging these quick glances when they thought I wasn't looking, and their voices got quieter whenever they talked about the inheritance details. When we got home, my uncle was already there waiting on our front porch. He had this tight smile and immediately started asking questions about the will. He kept saying things like how surprised everyone was and how Aunt Matilda must not have been thinking clearly after her hip surgery. Mom and Dad just stood there nodding while he talked. That's when the first red flag really hit me. Over the next few weeks, my parents started making these little comments about responsibility and how managing wealth was complicated. They'd bring up times I needed help with homework or forgot to do chores as examples of why I might need guidance. They scheduled a meeting with some financial advisor without asking me first. When I questioned it, they said they were just trying to protect me from making mistakes. The advisor spent the whole meeting talking about how young people with disabilities often struggle with complex financial decisions. He kept looking at my leg braces while he talked, like they somehow affected my brain. I started researching inheritance law during lunch at school because something felt wrong about all this. That's when I learned about competency challenges and how families sometimes use disability as grounds to control someone's assets. The thought made my stomach drop, but I tried to push it away. Surely my own parents wouldn't do that to me. But then I overheard a phone conversation between my mom and uncle. She was talking about how the money was life-changing for our whole family and how they needed to make sure it was handled properly. Uncle Mike said something about talking to their lawyer about options. When Mom saw me in the doorway, she quickly hung up and asked if I needed anything with this forced, casual tone. My parents became more controlling after that. They started opening my mail by accident and asking detailed questions about who I talked to at school. They said it was because people might try to take advantage of me now that word was getting around about the inheritance. They made me promise not to tell my friends specific details about the money. When I wanted to contact Aunt Matilda's lawyer directly, they said I should wait and let them handle the adult conversations. The isolation got worse over the following months. They stopped driving me to after-school activities, claiming gas was too expensive while simultaneously talking about how the inheritance could solve all our financial problems. They scheduled appointments with doctors and lawyers without including me in the conversations. I felt like I was slowly losing control of my own life. Then I found the letter Aunt Matilda left specifically for me, hidden in the back of the will documents. She wrote about being proud of my strength and hoping I would remember that I was stronger than people thought, especially when others wanted what I had. She also mentioned including special provisions in the will that required neutral evaluations before any competency proceedings. Reading that letter, I realized she had seen this coming. She knew my family would try to use my disability against me. The next day, I overheard my parents on the phone with someone discussing guardianship papers. Dad was saying how they needed to file before my 18th birthday to protect both me and the inheritance. Mom agreed and mentioned how my condition made me vulnerable to financial manipulation. I sat there listening to them plan to legally declare me incompetent, while my hands shook with anger and fear. That night, I tried to figure out who I could trust, but realized how isolated I had become. My parents had systematically cut me off from outside support while building their case. They planned to file the papers the next day. That would give them control over everything Aunt Matilda left me. I stared at her letter knowing I had maybe hours to act, but no clear way to fight back against the people who were supposed to protect me. I knew I had to act fast. The next morning, I slipped the letter into my backpack along with copies of the will documents I'd managed to photograph with my phone. My parents were already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out between them. They stopped talking the moment I entered. Dad cleared his throat and pushed a bowl of cereal toward me. Mom watched me carefully as I sat down, her fingers drumming against her coffee mug. The guardianship papers were right there, partially visible under a folder. I forced myself to eat normally while my heart pounded. At school, I went straight to the library during first period. The librarian knew me well enough not to question why I wasn't in class. I used the computer to search for the family friend Aunt Matilda had mentioned in her letter, a woman named Margie who had witnessed the will signing. The letter said she worked at a disability advocacy center downtown. My search revealed that Margie was a retired social worker who volunteered at the center 3 days a week. Today was one of those days. I memorized the address and bus route, then deleted my search history. The school counselor walked past the library window, and I ducked my head down instinctively. During lunch, I tried calling the advocacy center from the school payphone, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. When someone answered, I asked for Margie. They put me on hold for what felt like forever before coming back to say she'd called in sick. My stomach sank. I asked the school counselor if I could stay after school for college prep work. She seemed surprised, but agreed, mentioning offhandedly that my parents had called asking about my emotional state lately. The way she said it made me realize they were already building their case, documenting my supposed instability. After the final bell, I took the bus downtown instead of going home. The advocacy center was in an old brick building near the courthouse. I pushed through the heavy doors and approached the reception desk, trying to look confident despite my leg braces clicking against the tile floor. The receptionist looked up with a kind smile. I asked about Margie again, hoping maybe she'd come in after all. The woman's expression shifted slightly as she explained that Margie had been dealing with some family pressures recently and might be out for a few days. Something in her tone made me wonder if my parents had already gotten to her. The bus ride home felt endless. When I finally walked through our front door, I found my parents in my room. Dad was going through my desk drawers while Mom checked under my mattress. They both froze when they saw me. Dad straightened up, holding some of my medical records. He said they needed them for the protection filing, that it was all for my benefit. Mom avoided eye contact as she smoothed my bed sheets back down. I noticed my backpack had been moved from where I'd left it this morning. That's when I saw it. Mom's guilty expression as she glanced at Dad. They'd found the letter, they'd photographed it. They knew about Margie and the protective provisions Aunt Matilda had put in place. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. After dinner, I pretended to do homework in my room while listening through the thin walls. Dad was on the phone using his lawyer voice. He warned someone about not interfering in family decisions and mentioned legal consequences for outside interference. From the context, I knew he was talking to Margie. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend. She said my mom had called her parents asking about my recent behavior changes and whether she'd noticed any concerning signs. Even my friends were being pulled into this web of documentation and false concern. I searched my room carefully after my parents went to bed. Hidden behind my bookshelf, I found an old phone set to voice memo mode. It had been recording for hours. My hands trembled as I played back portions of it, hearing my parents discuss how to handle the social worker problem and discredit her testimony if needed. The front door opened downstairs. Uncle Mike's voice carried up the stairs as he greeted my parents. I crept to the top of the landing and watched him hand Mom a bouquet of flowers. He was being unusually kind, asking about me with exaggerated concern. His comments about family taking care of family and not needing strangers involved made my skin crawl. The next day at school, my cousin Emma pulled me aside during lunch. She was 2 years older and in college now, someone I'd always trusted, but her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She said I was having a breakdown from inheritance stress and should let the adults handle everything. I showed her the recording on my phone, thinking she'd understand once she heard our parents plotting, but Emma just shook her head, insisting they were trying to protect me from making mistakes with that much money. Her tone was patient, like she was talking to a child. They'd gotten to her too. When I got home, I discovered my parents had started intercepting my mail. A stack of opened envelopes sat on the kitchen counter. Mom explained the lawyer had advised them to protect me from financial scammers who target inheritance recipients. She made it sound so reasonable, so caring. I found a notice from school in the pile. My parents had requested I be pulled from my advanced classes due to increased stress affecting cognitive function. They were building an academic paper trail to support their competency case. The walls kept closing in. The next morning, I confronted the school counselor about my parents' request. She looked uncomfortable, shifting papers on her desk. She explained that my parents had provided medical documentation about inheritance stress affecting my decision-making abilities, she was legally bound to follow their requests as my guardians. During lunch, I slipped out to use the payphone again. This time I got through to the advocacy center and asked for Margie directly. There was a long pause before she came on the line, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd been advised by family attorneys not to discuss the inheritance situation with anyone, but then her tone changed. She mentioned she had documentation that Aunt Matilda wanted protected, but she couldn't talk safely from home anymore. She suggested meeting at the grocery store during her regular shopping time on Thursday, 2 days away. It felt like a lifetime. My physical therapy appointment that afternoon was suddenly canceled. Mom explained it was due to budget concerns, that we needed to be more careful with money until the inheritance was sorted out. Another advocate removed from my life. Another piece of evidence that I needed help managing responsibilities. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. I told my parents I had a group project after school and took the bus to the grocery store. Margie was in the cereal aisle pretending to compare prices. She looked older than I remembered, worry lines creasing her face. She spoke quietly as we walked, revealing that Aunt Matilda had predicted this exact scenario. My aunt had documented multiple conversations where my parents discussed my money like it was already theirs. The planning had started the day Aunt Matilda was diagnosed, not after her death. Margie agreed to provide testimony about my aunt's mental clarity and concerns about family dynamics, but she warned me that my parents had been trying to discredit her with other family members, painting her as a meddling outsider who had manipulated my aunt. She gave me copies of the documentation before we parted ways. Back at school the next day, my parents were in the principal's office when I arrived. They discovered I wasn't at school during lunch period earlier in the week and were questioning teachers about my whereabouts. They claimed concern about wandering behavior as another competency issue. My favorite history teacher pulled me aside after they left. She mentioned that my parents seemed more interested in documenting problems than solving them. She'd noticed the pattern of their visits, always focused on my supposed limitations rather than my consistent A grades in her class. That evening, I woke up to find my leg braces missing from beside my bed. My parents said they'd taken them to be repaired, but I needed to get ready for school. I struggled through my morning routine, nearly falling twice in the bathroom. That's when I caught it. The reflection of Mom's phone camera in the mirror as she filmed my struggles. The realization that Mom was documenting my struggles without the braces made my blood run cold. I pretended not to notice and continued getting ready, but my mind raced with the implications. They weren't just building a case anymore. They were manufacturing evidence. At breakfast, I watched Dad casually mention how concerned he was about my balance issues getting worse. Mom nodded sympathetically while sliding her phone into her pocket. The performance was seamless, but now I could see through it. Every word, every gesture was calculated. School became my only refuge, but even there, the walls were closing in. The counselor called me to her office during second period. She explained that my parents had submitted additional documentation showing concerning behavior patterns. Her discomfort was obvious as she read from their report about my supposed confusion and disorientation. I pulled out my own phone and showed her the timestamps from this morning, proof that I'd been fine until my braces mysteriously disappeared. The counselor's expression shifted as she processed this information. She made notes in my file, and I caught her writing something about family dynamics that needed further observation. During lunch, I used the library computer to email Margie the details about the missing braces. Her response came quickly. She'd seen this pattern before with families trying to establish guardianship. She advised me to document everything and mentioned that Aunt Matilda's lawyer had scheduled a neutral psychological evaluation for Friday. The timing was critical. My parents planned to file their guardianship papers on Wednesday. The pressure intensified when I returned home to find my parents had rearranged my room. They claimed they were looking for my braces to return them to the repair shop, but I noticed my private journals had been moved. Small sticky notes marked certain pages. More evidence gathering. That night, I heard them discussing their strategy with someone on speakerphone. The voice sounded like a doctor, confirming he'd received their documentation about my declining cognitive function. He mentioned adding notes to my medical file about increased confusion and poor decision making. The betrayal cut deep. This was our family physician who'd known me since childhood. I spent hours creating a detailed timeline of their manipulation tactics, emailing it to myself and Margie from the school computer the next morning. The evidence was overwhelming when laid out chronologically. The systematic isolation, the manufactured medical concerns, the convenient disappearance of my mobility aids. The school nurse noticed me struggling without my braces during PE and called my parents to express safety concerns. Their flustered response over the phone was telling. They promised to bring the braces immediately, caught off guard by this unexpected scrutiny. Within an hour, my braces magically reappeared, supposedly fixed. I used the returned phone to photograph pages from my parents' planning notebook that I discovered hidden in Dad's study. The pages detailed their financial situation, mounting debts, second mortgages, credit card bills. The inheritance wasn't just attractive to them, they desperately needed it. Margie called the school directly, asking to speak with me about a college preparation program. It was a cover story, but it worked. She informed me that Aunt Matilda had specifically named her as an alternative trustee option in the will. If the guardianship filing seemed premature or exploitative, she had legal standing to intervene. The revelation changed everything. My parents didn't know about this provision. Aunt Matilda had added it in a codicil just weeks before her death. Margie had helped her research protective measures specifically designed to prevent family exploitation of disabled heirs. My parents' behavior became increasingly erratic as Wednesday approached. They scheduled multiple appointments with doctors, therapists, and specialists, dragging me to each one while painting a picture of a teenager overwhelmed by impending wealth. But their story began showing cracks. The school counselor started documenting her own observations after our conversation. She noted my consistent academic performance, my clear communication skills, and the suspicious timing of my parents' concerns. She even reached out to my teachers, who universally reported that I showed no signs of the cognitive decline my parents described. During a particularly tense dinner, Mom let slip that they'd already spoken to contractors about renovating Aunt Matilda's house once the guardianship was approved. Dad shot her a warning look, but the damage was done. They were already spending money they didn't have, assuming control was inevitable. I made a calculated decision to confide in my history teacher, showing her the evidence I'd gathered. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as she reviewed the timeline. She offered to write a statement about my capabilities and the concerning pattern of my parents' recent behavior. The next morning brought a new crisis. My parents announced they'd moved the guardianship filing to that afternoon, 2 days early. The neutral evaluation wouldn't happen in time. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to think clearly. I texted Margie from the school bathroom, and she immediately sprang into action. Within an hour, she'd contacted Aunt Matilda's lawyer about the premature filing and the trustee provision. The lawyer couldn't directly intervene against my parents, but confirmed he would inform the court about the pending neutral evaluation. My parents arrived at school unexpectedly, claiming a family emergency required me to leave immediately. The school secretary hesitated, noting I had an important test that afternoon. Their insistence raised red flags, and she quietly called the counselor while pretending to check my attendance record. The counselor appeared quickly, asking pointed questions about the nature of the emergency. My parents' vague responses and visible agitation made her suspicious. She insisted on speaking with me privately before releasing me from school, buying precious time. In her office, I quickly explained the situation. The counselor's face hardened with determination. She made several phone calls while I sat there, including one to the school's legal advisor about their obligations when suspecting potential financial exploitation of a student. The standoff in the main office was tense. My parents demanded I leave with them immediately, while the counselor insisted on following proper procedures. Other staff members began noticing the commotion, and their attention made my parents visibly uncomfortable. Finally, the counselor offered a compromise. She would document their request to remove me from school, but noted she had serious concerns about my welfare that she was legally obligated to report. The implied threat of a social services investigation made my parents reconsider their approach. They left without me, but their parting looks promised this wasn't over. The counselor immediately helped me contact Margie, who revealed she'd already filed a formal request with the court for an emergency evaluation before any guardianship decision. The relief was temporary. When I got home, the house felt like a war zone. My parents were frantically making phone calls, trying to push through their filing before any intervention could stop them. They'd moved up their timeline because someone had tipped them off about Margie's involvement. Uncle Mike arrived with legal documents, attempting to convince me to sign a temporary power of attorney while the guardianship was sorted out. He painted it as a reasonable compromise, but I recognized it as another trap. Once they had any legal control, expanding it would be easier. I refused to sign anything anything without legal representation. The suggestion infuriated them. Dad accused me of being manipulated by outsiders who didn't understand our family. Mom cried about how hurt she was that I didn't trust them. The emotional manipulation was textbook, but it still stung. That night, I barricaded my door with a chair and stayed awake listening to them strategize. They discussed claiming I was having paranoid delusions about family members trying to steal from me. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were literally planning to steal from me while claiming I was delusional for thinking so. Morning brought unexpected allies. Several of Aunt Matilda's friends had heard about the guardianship filing through Margie. They began calling my parents, expressing concern about the rushed proceedings. Some mentioned conversations with Aunt Matilda about her worries regarding my parents' attitudes toward my disability. The pressure from multiple directions clearly rattled my parents. Their carefully constructed narrative was being challenged by people who'd known our family for years. Some of these friends had witnessed my parents making dismissive comments about my future prospects long before any inheritance was involved. At school, I learned the counselor had filed an official report about potential financial exploitation. This triggered a formal review process that would require my parents to justify their guardianship petition to multiple authorities. The system designed to protect vulnerable individuals was finally working in my favor. Margie met with me during lunch, bringing copies of Aunt Matilda's documentation. My aunt had been methodical, recording dates and direct quotes from conversations where my parents discussed my limitations and their plans for my future. The evidence painted a damning picture of long-held prejudices about my capabilities. The neutral evaluator contacted me directly, scheduling an assessment for that afternoon. My parents couldn't prevent it without looking suspicious. The evaluator was a respected professional who specialized in disability rights and capacity assessments. Her reputation for fairness was unassailable. The evaluation itself was straightforward. We discussed my daily routines, my academic performance, my understanding of financial concepts, and my future plans. I presented my documentation about my parents' manipulation tactics. The evaluator took careful notes, her expression professionally neutral throughout. My parents waited outside during the evaluation, pacing the hallway like caged animals. When I emerged, they immediately began questioning what I'd said. Their desperation was palpable. The careful facade they'd maintained for months was crumbling. That evening brought a family meeting that felt more like an interrogation. Mom and Dad demanded to know who was influencing me against them. They accused Margie of poisoning my mind and threatened legal action against her for interfering. Their threats rang hollow now that their own actions were under scrutiny. Emma arrived unexpectedly, and I initially tensed, remembering her earlier dismissal of my concerns. But something had changed. She'd been at a family dinner where my parents had contradicted their own previous statements about my capabilities. The inconsistencies had finally opened her eyes. She apologized for not believing me earlier and revealed that my parents had asked her to provide testimony about my limitations. They'd even tried to coach her on what to say. Her refusal to participate had led to an ugly confrontation that showed their true priorities. The walls continued closing in on my parents' scheme. The neutral evaluator submitted her preliminary report, finding no evidence of cognitive impairment and noting significant evidence of family pressure. The guardianship filing was suspended pending further investigation. My parents made one last desperate play. They threatened to contest Aunt Matilda's will entirely, claiming she'd been unduly influenced. The process could tie up the inheritance for years in legal battles. They presented it as mutually assured destruction. Either I accepted their guardianship or nobody got anything. But they'd underestimated both me and Aunt Matilda's preparation. Margie revealed that my aunt had recorded video testimony about her intentions, specifically addressing potential challenges to her mental capacity. She'd also established a legal fund to defend the will against contests. The school counselor arranged a meeting with all parties present, including Margie and a representative from the Disability Advocacy Center. My parents found themselves outnumbered by professionals who understood their tactics. Their attempts to paint me as incompetent fell flat against the documented evidence of their manipulation. During this meeting, more truth emerged. My parents' financial desperation went deeper than I'd realized. They'd been borrowing against expected inheritance money, telling creditors it was guaranteed. Their house of cards was collapsing, and they blamed me for not playing along. The extended family began choosing sides as word spread. Aunt Matilda's siblings were appalled to learn about my parents' actions. Some relatives who'd initially believed my parents' concerns about my capacity changed their positions after seeing the evidence of manipulation. As Thursday arrived, the guardianship filing was officially rejected. The court cited the neutral evaluation, the concerning pattern of behavior from my parents, and the protective provisions in Aunt Matilda's will. The judge recommended investigation into potential financial exploitation. My parents' response was predictable but still painful. They accused me of destroying our family for money. They claimed I'd chosen wealth over blood. The projection was staggering. They'd literally tried to steal my inheritance while accusing me of being money obsessed. The aftermath was messy but necessary. I stayed with Margie temporarily while arrangements were made for my independence. The school counselor helped coordinate support services to ensure I could manage daily life without my parents' assistance, proving I was more capable than they'd ever acknowledged. Some family relationships survived the ordeal, others didn't. Emma became a fierce advocate, helping explain the situation to relatives who'd only heard my parents' version. Uncle Mike eventually admitted he'd been promised a portion of the inheritance for his support, showing how deep the conspiracy went. Through it all, Aunt Matilda's letter remained my anchor. Her words about being stronger than others believed resonated deeply. She'd seen my potential when my own parents couldn't look past my leg braces. Her final gift wasn't just money, it was the push I needed to claim my independence. The legal battles weren't completely over, but the momentum had shifted decisively. My parents' credibility was shattered, their guardianship attempt failed, and their financial exploitation exposed. The very system they'd tried to use against me had become my shield. As I prepared for the final phase of this fight, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. I'd lost the parents I thought I had, but I'd gained something more valuable. Proof of my own capability, and a network of people who saw me as more than my disability. The inheritance would eventually be mine, but the real victory was already won. The complete truth emerged through multiple testimonies revealing my parents had begun planning inheritance control before Aunt Matilda's death, using my disability as their convenient excuse. The documentation was damning. Recorded conversations, financial planning meetings, and discussions about my limitations that predated the will reading by months. The official documentation that arrived the next morning vindicated my competency while highlighting my parents' systematic manipulation over several months. The evaluator's report was thorough, detailing not just my capabilities, but the concerning pattern of manufactured evidence and isolation tactics my parents had employed. I gathered the final evidence to present to the extended family, recordings of my parents' private conversations about using my disability against me. The audio was clear, their voices unmistakable as they discussed strategies to protect the family's financial future by controlling my inheritance. The extended family meeting that weekend was tense. Aunt Matilda's siblings sat stone-faced as they reviewed the evidence. My parents tried to interrupt several times, but Uncle Mike's own testimony about being promised a portion of the inheritance sealed their fate. The family rendered their judgment unanimously, supporting my right to inheritance independence while condemning my parents' exploitation attempts. My parents launched their desperate counterstrike that evening. They filed paperwork to contest Aunt Matilda's will on grounds of undue influence, claiming Margie had manipulated my aunt into excluding them from proper oversight. The move could potentially tie up the inheritance for years in legal battles, draining resources through attorney fees. I faced this unexpected setback by immediately contacting Aunt Matilda's lawyer. He'd anticipated this possibility and revealed that my aunt had specifically addressed will contests in her video testimony. She recorded herself with 2 witnesses present, explaining her decision-making process and explicitly stating her concerns about my parents' attitudes toward my disability. Some family members wavered under the pressure when my parents began calling relatives, threatening to divide the family permanently if they didn't support the will contest. The emotional blackmail was effective on some of the older relatives who valued family unity above all else. I had to demonstrate my independence by handling this legal complexity largely alone when Margie was advised by her own attorney to maintain some distance during the will contest. This became the true test of my capabilities, managing legal documents, coordinating with attorneys, and making strategic decisions without an adult advocate constantly present. The critical decision came down to 2 options: accept a quick settlement that would give my parents partial control through a trust arrangement, or fight the will contest through what could be a lengthy legal battle that might drain significant inheritance funds and legal fees. I spent sleepless nights weighing these options. I chose to fight the will contest, a decision that triggered rapid escalation as my parents realized they'd they'd fundamentally underestimated both my determination and my capabilities. Their attorney began questioning whether they truly wanted to proceed after reviewing Aunt Matilda's video testimony and the evaluator's report. All parties converged for a final family meeting at my request. I'd asked Aunt Matilda's siblings to mediate, hoping to avoid a protracted legal battle. My parents arrived expecting me to choose family harmony over the inheritance, still believing I would crumble under family pressure. The truth about my parents' deeper motivations finally emerged when I presented evidence of their financial planning conversations from months before Aunt Matilda's death. Bank statements showed they'd been living beyond their means for years, accumulating debt while counting on eventual access to family money. My parents' final secret was revealed through documents I'd found in Dad's study. They'd been accumulating debt based on expected inheritance access, telling creditors they would have control over my assets due to my disability. The loans totaled more than their house was worth, making my independence financially devastating for them. Emma provided unexpected support by confirming our parents had asked her to provide false testimony about my limitations. She revealed they'd tried to coach her responses, even providing a written script about my supposed inability to handle stress or make decisions. Her refusal to participate had led to them threatening to cut off her college tuition support. I faced the final moral choice: expose my parents' financial desperation in court, which would likely lead to bankruptcy and public humiliation, or handle the matter privately to preserve their dignity while still protecting my inheritance. The decision weighed heavily on me. I chose to offer a private resolution, proposing that my parents withdraw their will contest and guardianship attempts in exchange for my agreement not to pursue charges of financial exploitation or expose their debt situation publicly. I also offered to pay off their most pressing debts once I gained access to the inheritance, not because I owed them, but because I wanted to move forward without destroying them completely. My parents' immediate rejection of this generous offer revealed their true priority was control over the money, not family unity or my well-being. They demanded full trustee control or threatened to drag the legal battle out for years. This response finally convinced the remaining family doubters about their true motivations. Their final manipulation attempt came that night when Mom called Emma claiming they would lose their house and suggesting they might harm themselves if I abandoned them. I recognized this as emotional blackmail and calmly called emergency services to request a welfare check, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. The police arrival at my parents' house for the welfare check shattered their manipulation attempt. Officers found them perfectly fine but angry about my overreaction. The incident created an official record of their threat being used as manipulation rather than genuine crisis. My parents' last desperate claim that I was ungrateful and had turned against family fell flat when extended family members witnessed my consistent attempts at compromise versus their escalating demands. Even relatives who initially supported them began distancing themselves after seeing the evidence. The will contest collapsed within 2 weeks when my parents' attorney withdrew from the case. He cited the overwhelming evidence against their claims and advised them to accept the original will terms. Without legal representation and facing potential exploitation charges, they had no choice but to abandon their contest. I secured my inheritance independence through the court's final ruling, which not only upheld Aunt Matilda's will, but also noted the disturbing pattern of attempted financial exploitation by my parents. The judge's words carried weight with the extended family, validating everything I'd endured. My parents privately met with me one last time, finally admitting they'd gotten desperate about money and thought I'd be easier to control because of my disability. Mom broke down crying about how they'd convinced themselves they were protecting me, while really just wanting access to the money. Dad couldn't meet my eyes as he admitted to the loans taken against expected inheritance control. The final obstacles were removed when the court approved Margie as a temporary trustee until I turned 21, with oversight provisions that satisfied concerned family members while maintaining my autonomy. This arrangement allowed me immediate access to funds for education and living expenses while protecting the bulk of the inheritance. A new family equilibrium slowly began forming over the following weeks. I maintained relationships with extended family members who'd supported me, while my parents faced the consequences of their manipulation attempts. Some relatives still spoke to them but kept them at arm's length, having seen their true nature. The last revelation came when I finally read Aunt Matilda's complete letter, which contained a final page I'd missed before. She wrote about watching my parents dismiss my potential throughout my childhood, making comments about how I'd never live independently and would always need family support. She encouraged me to build the life I chose, not the one others chose for me, and to never let anyone use my disability to limit my dreams. 6 months later, I successfully managed my inheritance responsibilities while maintaining my independence. My parents eventually sought family counseling after facing the reality of their actions and their financial situation. We began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship on equal terms, with clear boundaries about financial matters and respect for my autonomy. My competency was no longer questioned by anyone. The inheritance provided security for college and future goals, managed through the trustee arrangement that I actively participated in. The family remained fractured but functional, with some relationships forever changed, but others strengthened through the crisis. I surrounded myself with chosen family, including Margie, who became a mentor figure, the school counselor who continued checking in even after graduation, and extended relatives who'd stood by me during the fight. Emma and I grew closer than ever, bonded by the experience of seeing our parents' true priorities. Most importantly, I learned to recognize manipulation tactics and trust my own judgment. The crisis had forced me to advocate for myself in ways I never imagined possible. I was ultimately stronger and more self-reliant than before, having proven to everyone, including myself, that my disability didn't define my capabilities. The inheritance Aunt Matilda left me was more than money. It was the catalyst for claiming my independence and building a life based on my own choices rather than others' limitations. Her faith in me, documented so carefully in her will provisions, had given me the tools to fight for my autonomy. I honored her memory by living fully and independently, exactly as she'd hoped I would.